Hello and welcome to our SPOC, or Scrum Product Owner Certified course. In this session, we will look at another of the 5 aspects of SPOC framework, risk. As part of this chapter, we will discuss what is risk, the steps in risk management procedure, such as identification, assessment, prioritization, mitigation, communication, how to minimize risks through the use of Scrum approach, risks in portfolio and programs, and finally, Scrum versus traditional project management with respect management of risk. Let us begin by understanding what a risk is and how risk management in Scrum is addressed by the risk aspect. The purpose of the risk aspect is to define risk and describe how to manage risks in Scrum and the tools that can be used in this regard. What is a risk? Risk is an uncertain event or events that can affect the achievement of a project's objectives and may contribute to the project's success or failure. Uncertainties that can have a positive impact on a project are called opportunities, whereas uncertainties that could negatively impact a project are called threats. For example, a software project is normally prone to risks such as key staff leaving or people with required skills not being available, resulting in delays. That's a threat. Requirements may not be gathered or understood accurately by the team, leading to poor quality deliverable. That's a threat. A new technology may become available, leading better quality product. That's called an opportunity. Managing risk must be proactive and iterative in order to avoid or minimize the probability of major issues cropping up during project execution. Risk management begins when a project is initiated and continues throughout the life of the project. One of the biggest advantages of proactive risk management is that it enables the product owner and the stakeholders to assess and confirm viability of the business and make more informed decisions on continuation of a project. Risk management is Scrum. In Scrum, deliverables are created in short iterations called sprints. This enables the Scrum core team to minimize the project's exposure to risks. However, uncertainties can occur anytime, even in the simplest of projects, so it is important to have a strategy on how to manage them. Central to risk management is the assessment of the probability of a risk occurring and the probable impact in the event of the occurrences. Risks with the high probability and high impact rating should be ideally prioritized over those with a lower rating. It is helpful to calculate the probability and impact of a risk if the identified risks are analyzed for the possible causes of their occurrences and the potential effects on the project's objectives if and when they occur. Difference between risks and issues. It is helpful to know the difference between risks and issues in order to manage them effectively. Risks are the uncertainties related to a project that could significantly alter the outcome of the project in a positive or negative way. Some examples of risks for a construction project can be raw materials required for construction may not be supplied in time, or their prices may go up during construction, or they may be of inferior quality. The painting crew might be delayed due to heavy rain, which could negatively impact the project schedule, etc. Issues are those events that are occurring or have occurred and affect the achievement of project objectives negatively. As issues are events that are occurring or have occurred, there is no need for probability assessment as required in the case for a risk. Issues must be assessed for impact and managed in order to successfully deliver the project's results. Some issues that a project can face are funding is not approved, requirements are unclear, etc. It must be noted that if risks are not effectively addressed, in time they may become issues. Hence, the goal of risk management is to be prepared, with plans in place, to deal with any risks that can occur. Risk attitude. Risk attitude refers to the attitude of the key stakeholders or organization toward risk with regard to an initiative. It is important to understand the risk attitude of the stakeholders as they influence the project's initiation and continuation based on the project's exposure to risks. Risk attitude is influenced by 3 factors, namely, risk appetite indicates the amount of uncertainty that the stakeholders or the organization is willing to take on and initiate or continue with the project or any other initiative. Risk tolerance indicates the degree, amount, or volume of risk stakeholders will withstand. Risk threshold refers to the level at which a risk is acceptable to the stakeholder organization. A risk will fall above or below the risk threshold. If it is below, then the stakeholder or organization is more likely to accept the risk. Essentially, the risk attitude of the stakeholders determines how much risk is considered acceptable for an initiative to begin and continue. Risk attitude is helpful for the Scrum core team in understanding the tolerance levels of the stakeholders in relation to various factors of the project, such as cost, quality, scope, schedule, etc. Risk attitude can be measured using numerous tools or technique. One such tool is utility function. Utility function is a model which is used to express the stakeholders' level or willingness to accept risk. There are three categories in the utility function model depicting the attitude of stakeholders toward risk-taking. They are risk-averse, risk-neutral, and risk-seeking. Now, let us define each. Risk-averse. This category of stakeholders is generally unwilling to accept any amount of risk irrespective of the anticipated benefit. All identified risks must be remedied for an initiative to begin and continue. Risk neutral. This category of stakeholders is neither risk-averse nor risk-seeking. For example, if there are three projects, say A, B, and C, each with a varying degree of uncertainty and returns, the stakeholders who are risk neutral would prefer a project that neither has very high degree of uncertainty nor very low returns. This category of stakeholders is willing to take on reasonable amounts of risk for a given level of returns. Risk-seeking. Stakeholder is willing to accept a project with high level of risks if it can deliver high returns or benefits. For example, if presented with two projects, say A and B, and if A is a project with low risks and average returns and project B is high risk and high returns, then the risk-seeking stakeholders would generally choose project B. Now that we understand what risks are and the Scrum approach to risk management, let's discuss in detail how to implement risk management in a Scrum project. Risk management procedure. Risk management consists of 5 steps. They are risk identification, risk assessment, risk prioritization, risk mitigation, and risk communication. In this procedure, first 4 steps are sequential, whereas the 5th step runs in parallel with other steps. For example, when the Scrum team members identify a risk, they communicate it to the Scrum Master, and then the risk will be assessed, after which there will be another communication regarding the results of the assessment. Now let's look at the first step, risk identification. This step involves recognizing all the threats and opportunities that the project might be exposed to. As part of this step, the Scrum team members should attempt to identify potential uncertain events that could affect the project. This step is iterative in nature and is carried out throughout the life of the project. To ensure value-based prioritization and iterative development, all the risks that are identified become inputs to several Scrum processes, including create prioritized product backlog, groom prioritized product backlog, and demonstrate and validate sprint. Risk identification tools and techniques. Now let's discuss how to identify risks. The techniques that can be used by the Scrum core team to identify risks are 1. Review of lessons. One of the most common techniques to identify risks is review of lessons. The Scrum team should not only review lessons from previous projects, but also from sprints in the same project in order to identify uncertainties that could affect the project. At the end of the project, it is also important to forward lessons from the current project to corporate management so that these lessons can be applied in future projects. 2 most important processes used in Scrum projects to identify and review lessons are retrospect sprint and retrospect project. 2. Risk checklist. Another tool that can be used to identify risks is risk checklist. Risk checklists generally contain the risks or categories of risks that are common to a particular type of project. For example, some of the common risks associated with a software development project are required skills may not be available, New solution may not be compatible with the current standard processes, etc. Following is a template of risk checklist. 3. Risk prompts lists. The major difference between risk checklists and risk prompt lists is that risk checklists contain the actual risks that the project may be exposed to, whereas risk prompts lists are used to stimulate thoughts regarding the source from which risks may originate. A particular risk may have multiple sources, and identifying these sources enables the Scrum team to accurately estimate the probability and proximity of that particular risk. 4. Brainstorming. In brainstorming sessions, relevant stakeholders and members of the Scrum core team openly discuss and share knowledge on the project, which can be used to identify risks to the project. Brainstorming sessions are normally conducted by a facilitator. 5. Risk breakdown structure, RBS. Another key tool used to identify risks is risk breakdown structure. In this structure, all identified project risks are categorized based on commonalities. For example, risks may be categorized as financial, technical, or safety-related. This allows the team to plan for and address each risk. The following is a generic template for RBS. Next step in the risk management procedure is risk assessment. The primary aim of risk assessment is to enable the Scrum core team to determine the net effect of the identified risks on the expected business value from the project. If the risk impact is significant enough to outweigh the business justification, a decision must be made whether to continue with the project or not. Risk assessment will also help the Scrum team to prioritize risks and plan mitigation actions to address high-priority risks. The assessment of risks is done to understand the risk's probability, proximity, and impact. Probability of risks refers to the likelihood of the risks occurring, the chance of the risk occurring, whereas proximity refers to when the risk might occur, the time. Impact refers to the probable effect of the risks on the project and the organizations involved. To estimate the probability of risks, techniques such as probability trees, Pareto analysis, and probability and impact matrix can be used. And to assess the net effect of identified risks on project or organization, various tools and techniques such as risk models and expected monetary value can be used. Now let's look at some of these tools and techniques in detail. Risk assessment techniques. 1. Risk meeting. One of the most common techniques to assess risks is risk meeting. The product owner can call a meeting of the Scrum core team and can also, optionally, invite relevant stakeholders to the meeting. In the meeting, the team will prioritize identified risks for mitigation action based on their assessment of the risk's probability, proximity, and impact on project objectives. 2. Probability trees. Probability trees are used to present each risk with its probable causes and effects on the achievement of project objectives. The probability of each possible outcome is indicated in the appropriate branch and then multiplied by its assessed impact to get an expected value for each outcome possibility. The outcome values are then summed together to calculate the overall expected impact of a risk to a project. This is shown in the following diagram. 3. Pareto analysis. Pareto analysis involves ranking risks on the basis of their impact on the project. The Scrum team can estimate the importance of each risk and address the most important risk. For example, in the following figure, risk 1 has the highest impact and should preferably be addressed first. 4. Probability impact grid. It is a technique in which each risk is assessed for its probability and impact. Generally, numerical ratings are assigned to the probability and impact of the identified risks. And probability and impact values of each risk are multiplied to derive the severity value of that risk. Once all the identified risks have severity values, they are ranked hierarchically. The method of assigning probability and impact values to risks varies depending on the project and number of risks being evaluated, as well as existing organizational processes and procedures. However, by applying the simple P, probability, times I, impact formula, Risk severity can be calculated on a numerical or categorical scale. For example, the severity score for a risk with the probability of 50% and an impact rating of 0.6 would be calculated as follows. 0.5 probability times 0.6 impact equals 0.3. 5. Expected monetary value, EMV. Expected monetary value, EMV, of a risk is calculated by multiplying the monetary impact of the risk with its probability as approximated by the customer. Expected monetary value equals risk impact in dollars times risk probability as a percentage. For example, a risk with an estimated negative impact of $1,000 and a 50% probability of occurring would estimate in an EMV as follows. EMV equals $1,000 times 0.50 equals $500. Now that we've discussed risk identification and risk assessment, let's understand the other steps in the risk management procedure. Risk prioritization. After determining the probability, proximity, and impact of the identified risks and their net impact on the project, if the project is still within the risk appetite of the organization, we can proceed with the next step of the risk management procedure, that is, risk prioritization. In Scrum, all identified risks of the project are taken into account when creating the Prioritized Product Backlog in the Create Prioritized Product Backlog process. They are also considered when the Prioritized Product Backlog is updated in the Scrum Prioritized Product Backlog process. Hence, the Prioritized Product Backlog is also referred to as Risk-Adjusted Prioritized Product Backlog. Now, let's look at how risks are mapped with user stories and epics in the Prioritized Product Backlog. In the Create Prioritized Product Backlog or Scrum Prioritized Product Backlog processes, prioritized user stories and epics from the existing Prioritized Product Backlog and the prioritized list of risks are combined to create an updated, risk-adjusted Prioritized Product Backlog. Let's analyze how this is done. The steps for updating identified risks in the Prioritized Product Backlog, which contains user stories and epics, are as follows. 1. After identifying and assessing the risks to the project, create a list of prioritized risks, e.g., the risks can be prioritized by value using expected monetary value techniques. 2. From the list of prioritized risks, select the risks that need to be mitigated, and also select the risks that require immediate mitigation actions, that is, the risks for which the Scrum team should take specific risk action in the next sprint. 3. Create a list of user stories by breaking down epics, or large user stories, into manageable user stories and/or writing new user stories. Update the user stories in the Prioritized Product Backlog. Then prioritize the user stories according to their value so that the Scrum team can deliver them in the ensuing sprint. The value of each user story may be evaluated based on its expected return on investment. 4. Combine lists in Step 2 and Step 3 and prioritize them by value to arrive at the updated Prioritized Product Backlog. Figure 7.4 illustrates the risk prioritization process. The next step in the risk management procedure is risk mitigation. The mitigation actions to address the risks will depend on the priority of those risks. As discussed earlier, the team prioritizes risks based on the risk's probability, proximity, and impact. The iterative nature of Scrum, with its rapid turnaround time and feedback cycles, allows for early detection of failures and snags. Hence, it can be said that Scrum has a natural mitigation feature built in. There are numerous types of risk mitigation actions that the team can use. Generally, these mitigation actions are proactive or reactive in nature. For example, in the case of a project involving a cruise voyage to increase an organization's brand image, a common risk can be inclement weather. For this risk, a mitigation action can be if the risk materializes, then one of the places to visit during the voyage will be dropped from the itinerary. This is clearly a reactive mitigation action. Similarly, a proactive mitigation action can be Postponement of the cruise voyage until the meteorological department predicts good weather for the duration of the planned cruise. Not all risks need to be mitigated, as some with very low probability of occurrence or with proximity beyond the project or with very low impact can be accepted. A risk can also be accepted in situations where there is apprehension of secondary risks. These secondary risks may deter the product owner from taking any mitigation action. Several identified risks updated in the Prioritized Product Backlog get mitigated during the Create Deliverables process when the tasks related to user stories defined in the Prioritized Product Backlog process are carried out by the Scrum team. In Scrum, the ownership for managing risks related to business aspects is clearly with the product owner, and the ownership of implementing risk responses during the course of a sprint is with the Scrum team. The Scrum guidance body can be approached for advice on the way risk responses are implemented and whether the planned and implemented risk response actions are aligned with the guidelines of the organization. The Scrum Master keeps a close eye on the potential risks that could affect the project and keeps the product owner and Scrum team informed. Risk-based spike. A risk-based spike is an experiment that involves prototyping the project on hand to better understand potential risks. In a spike, an intense 2 to 3 day exercise is conducted to help the team determine the uncertainties that could affect the project. For example, if you're exploring a new combination of a drug, then a spike can be conducted at the beginning of the project, before the develop epics or create prioritized product backlog processes are applied to understand the potential risks for the project better. Risk-based spikes are useful when the Scrum team is working with and getting accustomed to new technologies or tools, or when user stories are lengthy. They also help in estimating time and effort more accurately. The next step is risk communication. As mentioned earlier, risk communication step runs in parallel with the other steps of risk management procedure. Risks are communicated not just to the internal stakeholders, but also to external stakeholders who need to know about the risk. Information provided to stakeholders related to risk should include potential impact and the plans for responding to each risk. This communication is ongoing and should occur in parallel with the 4 sequential steps discussed thus far: risk identification, assessment, prioritization, and mitigation. The Scrum team may also discuss specific risks related to their tasks and the Scrum Master during daily stand-up meetings. The product owner is responsible for prioritizing risks and for communicating the prioritized list to the Scrum team. An important tool which can be used for communicating information related to risks is the Risk Burndown Chart. Risk Burndown Chart. Expected monetary value, EMV, is one of the preferred tools to be used for assessing risks. The information gathered during risk assessment using EMV may be used to create a risk burndown chart. A risk burndown chart depicts severity of the cumulative project risks over a particular duration of time that is acceptable. The probability of the various risks is plotted on top of each other to show the cumulative risk on the y-axis. The identification and evaluation of risks on the project and the creation of the risk burndown chart are done in the initiate phase. Then, at predetermined time intervals, new risks may be identified and assessed, and the existing risks should be reevaluated and updated accordingly on the chart. An appropriate time to do this is during the sprint planning meeting. Tracking risks in this manner allows the team to recognize trends in risk exposure and take appropriate action as necessary. Figure 7.5 shows a sample risk burndown chart. We have discussed the risk management procedure in detail. Now, let's understand how Scrum helps minimize risks. The following Scrum practices help minimize risks in a Scrum project. 1. Flexibility in managing changes. Business environment-related risks are largely minimized in Scrum due to the flexibility in adding or modifying requirements at any time in the project lifecycle. This flexibility enables the organization to respond to threats or opportunities from the business environment and unforeseen requirements whenever they arise, with usually low cost of managing such risks. 2. Gathering regular feedback. Risks related to customer expectations are minimized in a Scrum project as the Scrum framework, being iterative in nature, provides scope to the Scrum core team to obtain feedback from the stakeholders and define expectations throughout the project lifecycle. This ensures that the project stakeholders, as well as the team, are not caught off guard by miscommunicated requirements. 3. Emphasizing team ownership over individual accountability. Risks related to estimation are reduced as the Scrum team estimates and takes ownership of the sprint backlog items. This leads to more accurate estimation and timely delivery of product increments. 4. Transparency in processes. Risk related to non-detection of failures and snags are minimized as the Scrum principle of transparency, around which the framework is built, ensures that the risks are detected and communicated early. This leads to better risk handling and mitigation. Moreover, in a project where multiple Scrum teams are operating, during Scrum of Scrums meetings, impediments that one team is facing that may affect the other Scrum team in the future are identified and communicated, and the teams can collaborate and address these concerns better by recognizing them in updated impediments log. 5. Delivering value iteratively. Iterative development reduces investment risk. Continuous delivery of value throughout the Scrum project lifecycle, as potentially shippable deliverables are created in every sprint, reduces risks to investment. Now let's discuss risk management in relation to portfolios and programs that a project might be part of. Risks in projects in relation portfolios and programs. While some risks related to individual projects can originate because of the project deliverable, others may originate because of the project being part of a program or a portfolio or both. During risk assessment in portfolios and programs, if it is determined that a risk may affect an individual project, relevant information about that risk must be communicated to the project's product owner and Scrum team. The product owner and the Scrum team can document these risks in Prioritized Product Backlog, and depending on the severity of the risks, they can stop and replan the current sprint to address the risk. In case of low priority risks, they can be addressed in subsequent sprints. Inherent risks, which are identified as project level, can be managed by the Scrum core team using the risk-adjusted Prioritized Product Backlog. However, there can also be risks identified in the project that can affect the portfolio or program that the project is part of. These need to be communicated to the respective portfolio and program personnel. Now, let us understand in brief how risks are handled at the portfolio and program levels. Risks in portfolio. 1. When risks are identified, either by the portfolio team or other stakeholders, the portfolio product owner should capture them in portfolio's Prioritized Product Backlog, and then assesses the risk for factors such as will they occur during the project, if yes, when they might occur, and what will be their impact on the achievement of portfolio objectives. Once the risks are assessed, the portfolio product owner should prioritize them and plan for appropriate mitigation actions. 2. In case of identification of risks that affect the programs and projects that are part of the portfolio product owner should communicate them to the relevant stakeholders, the program teams, and the project teams. In some cases, the portfolio team may have to assume the ownership of specific project and program risks. Risks in program. 1. When risks are identified by the program team, project teams that are part of the program, or by any other stakeholders, the program product owner should capture them in Program Prioritized Product Backlog, and then assesses the risks for their proximity, probability, and impact on the achievement of program objectives. Once the risks are assessed, the program product owner should prioritize them and plan for appropriate mitigation actions. 2. Whenever risks that affect the projects that are part of the program or the portfolio which the program is part of, the program product owner should communicate them to the relevant stakeholders, the portfolio teams, and the project teams. In some cases, the program team may have to assume the ownership of specific project risks. Figure 7.6 demonstrates how risks can be managed within the Scrum flow for both portfolios and programs. We have until now discussed Scrum's approach to risk management in detail. Let us complete this chapter with a discussion on how risk management in Scrum is different from the traditional ways of managing risk in a project. Scrum versus traditional project management. We know that Scrum and most of the traditional project management methods define risk as uncertain events that could positively or negatively affect the achievement of project objectives. And also that the procedure for managing risk is quite similar. That is, risks are identified, assessed, mitigation actions are planned, implemented, and communicated continually. Then what differentiates Scrum's approach to risk management from that of a traditional project management method? Let's have a look. In traditional project management methods, the emphasis is on detailed upfront planning to identify and assess risks as well as to determine risk responses for all the identified project risks. During project execution, any project team member can identify risks and the project manager or the project management office or project support staff can update them in the risk log or risk register. The project manager regularly monitors and controls all risks and usually assigns specific individuals in the team to take responsibility for managing different aspects of risk. In Scrum, any Scrum team member or external stakeholder can identify risks, and the product owner can update the identified risks in the risk-adjusted Prioritized Product Backlog. The Scrum principles of empirical process control and iterative development enable the Scrum team to constantly keep identifying risks and adding them to the Prioritized Product Backlog, where such risks are prioritized with other existing user stories in the backlog to be mitigated in subsequent sprints. The Scrum team has collective responsibilities for managing all risks for the sprint. The difference is that Scrum emphasizes collective ownership and management of risks, whereas traditional project management methods stress on individual accountability. Also in Scrum, as it believes in empirical process control, there is less importance for detailed upfront planning, which saves resources that can be invested in more productive activities. This concludes our session on risk. Thank you for learning with us.